Richard Caldwell, billionaire, savors the aroma of his victory. $100 million deal inked over apple pie. He doesn't see Margaret, the waitress refilling his coffee, her hand trembling as she recognizes the formula on his notepad. More coffee, she asks, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs. He's about to poison thousands. It's make deals over her homemade apple pie. She'd seen fortunes won and lost across those worn vinyl booths, but she'd never spoken up. Not once until that Tuesday morning, when Richard Caldwell, the pharmaceutical billionaire, spread those papers across table 6. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she refilled his coffee cup, recognizing the chemical formula scrolled in his neat handwriting. It was wrong, dangerously wrong, the same mistake that had taken her late husband 20 years ago. Richard was about to sign a $1 million deal based on research that could hurt thousands of people, and Margaret was just a waitress. But sometimes the most important voices come from the most unexpected places. Where are you watching? From tonight, Richard Caldwell hadn't always been a billionaire. Growing up in a small Iowa town, not unlike the one where Mickey's Diner now stood, he learned the value of hard work from his father, a country doctor who treated patients regardless of their ability to pay. Those early lessons had shaped Richard's vision when he'd started Caldwell Pharmaceuticals 40 years ago to make life-saving medications affordable for everyone. But somewhere along the way, between board meetings and profit margins, he'd lost touch with that simple dream. This morning's meeting was supposed to be the culmination of everything. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, his head researcher, sat across from him in the diner's corner booth, her laptop displaying the final clinical trial results for their new heart medication. The small-town setting had been Richard's idea. He'd wanted privacy for this historic moment, away from the corporate towers, hand-prying eyes of competitors. Mickey's Diner, with its faded checkered floors and the smell of bacon grease, reminded him of the diners from his childhood. The trials exceeded our expectations, Elena said, her voice barely containing her excitement. If we can get FDA approval, this could revolutionize heart disease treatment for millions. Richard nodded, studying the chemical formula she'd written on his notepad. The medication would be their most profitable product yet, especially at the price point they'd discussed. He'd already arranged the manufacturing deal with Brightstar Industries, $100 million that would flood the market with their new drug within 6 months. Margaret had noticed the expensive cars in the parking lot when she'd arrived for her morning shift. In 37 years of working at Mickey's, she'd developed an eye for important meetings. The silver-haired man in the tailored coat carried himself like someone accustomed to being listened to, while the younger woman with him had the intense focus of a scientist. Margaret had been a chemistry teacher before life changed her plans, before her husband David's illness had drained their savings and forced her to take whatever work she could find. As she approached their table with the coffee pot, fragments of their conversation drifted toward her. Heart medication, clinical trials, molecular compounds. Her steps slowed as she caught sight of the formula written on the man's notepad. The chemical structure looked familiar, too familiar. Her hand tightened on the coffee pot's handle as memories flooded back. David lying in the hospital bed, trusting the doctors who'd prescribed an experimental heart medication. The same basic compound structure, just arranged slightly differently. The same promising results in initial trials, followed by devastating side effects that the researchers hadn't anticipated. More coffee? Margaret asked quietly, her voice steady despite the recognition dawning in her chest. Richard glanced up with the polite but distant smile of someone accustomed to being served by invisible people. She refilled his cup, her eyes drawn again to the formula. The molecular arrangement was wrong, not obviously, but subtly, in a way that would only show up after months of use. She'd spent years studying David's case, trying to understand what had gone wrong, consulting with specialists who'd explained the chemical interactions that had ultimately stopped his heart. Elena was already pulling out her phone, ready to call the FDA contact who'd expedite their approval process. Richard reached for his pen to sign the manufacturing agreement. In minutes, this formula would be locked into production, and there would be no turning back. Margaret refilled Elena's cup, her mind racing. She was just a waitress. Who would believe her? Who would listen to a 70-year-old woman in a coffee-stained apron when a billionaire and his team of experts had spent years developing this medication? But as she watched Richard's pen hover over the signature line, Margaret thought about David's last words in the hospital. "Promise me you'll speak up when it matters." The weight of that promise settled over her shoulders like a familiar coat. Margaret returned to the kitchen, her heart pounding against her ribs. Through the service window, she watched Richard and Elena discussing distribution strategies, their excitement growing with each passing minute. She'd faced this choice before, 20 years ago, when David had first started experiencing the irregular heartbeats that his doctors had dismissed as stress. She'd questioned the medication, then had researched the compound on her own, but she'd been younger and less sure of herself. "Trust the experts," everyone had said. "What do you know about medicine?" The regret still ate at her some nights, but this time felt different. This time, she wasn't questioning a doctor's prescription for one patient. She was looking at a formula that could affect thousands, maybe millions of people. Margaret pulled out her phone. Its screen cracked from being dropped too many times and searched for Dr. James Morrison at the university. David's case had interested him enough that he'd spent months analyzing the chemical structure that had killed her husband. If anyone could confirm her suspicions, it would be Jim. "Mickey's Diner, this is Margaret," she whispered into the phone when he answered. "I need your help with something urgent." She described the formula as best she could remember, watching through the window as Richard began organizing his papers. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment before asking her to text him a photo. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to position her phone's camera discreetly, pretending to wipe down the counter near their table. "Margaret." Dr. Morrison's voice was grave when he called back 5 minutes later. "You're right to be concerned. That molecular arrangement, it's almost identical to the compound that killed David. The slight modification they've made might actually make it worse. It could mask the early warning symptoms until it's too late." Through the service window, Margaret watched Elena showing Richard projected sales figures on her laptop screen. Hundreds of millions in revenue, thousands of jobs created, a medical breakthrough that would cement Richard's legacy as a humanitarian businessman, all built on a foundation that could crumble into tragedy. Margaret had learned something about herself over the years of serving coffee and watching people's stories unfold across her tables. She learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen between strangers in the quiet moments when someone's guard is down. She'd held the hands of truckers calling home to apologize to their children. She'd listened to farmers worry about losing their land. She'd watched young couples plan their futures over shared pieces of pie. Every story mattered. Every person deserved to be heard. The bell above the diner's front door chimed as another customer entered, but Margaret barely noticed. She was thinking about David's smile when they'd first gotten married, how he'd trusted her completely when she'd warned him about taking shortcuts with his carpentry work. "You always see things I miss," he'd said. "Promise me you'll never stop speaking up." The memory strengthened her resolve like steel in her spine. Richard was reaching for his pen again, this time with the deliberate motion of a man ready to make history. Elena had her phone in hand, finger poised over her FDA contacts number. Margaret dried her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the counter. "If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." She walked toward table 6, carrying with her 37 years of watching people, 20 years of missing David, and a lifetime of knowing that sometimes love means risking everything to protect strangers you'll never meet again. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, her voice barely audible above the diner's morning bustle. Richard looked up, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to polite attention when he saw her weathered face. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help noticing your formula there." She nodded toward his notepad, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. "I think there might be a problem." Elena's fingers paused over her phone screen. Richard set down his pen, his businessman's instincts immediately on alert. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" His tone was carefully controlled, but Margaret caught the edge of impatience underneath. She'd heard that same tone from doctors, lawyers, and experts who dismissed her concerns about David's medication. "The molecular structure you've written down," Margaret continued, her voice growing steadier. "I've seen something very similar before. It didn't end well." She pulled out her phone, showing them the photo she'd taken of David's medical records. The same chemical structure, just slightly different. My husband died from a medication with this exact arrangement 20 years ago. Richard's face hardened. Mom, I appreciate your concern, but this formula has been tested extensively by teams of experts. We've invested millions in clinical trials. He stopped himself, clearly fighting to remain polite. Elena looked between them, uncertain whether to intervene or continue with her call. Margaret felt the familiar weight of being dismissed, but this time she didn't back down. I was a chemistry teacher for 15 years before my husband got sick, she said quietly. I spent months studying his case, working with specialists to understand what went wrong. The compound you're using creates a delayed reaction. The heart develops a dependency, but the symptoms don't show up until it's too late to reverse the damage. That's impossible, Elena interjected, her scientific training kicking in. Our trials followed patients for 18 months. We would have seen any cardiac complications, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty, and Margaret noticed her glancing again at the formula on Richard's notepad. Margaret pulled out a worn folder from her purse, David's medical records, research papers, correspondence with doctors. She'd carried these documents for 20 years, unable to throw them away, never knowing why. Now she understood. The medication my husband took was approved after 18 months of trials too, she said, spreading the papers on their table. The problems didn't start showing up until month 22. By then it was too late for him and dozens of other patients. Richard stared at the medical documents, his certainty beginning to crack. He'd built his empire on being thorough, on trusting science and data. But something in this woman's eyes reminded him of his father, the same unwavering conviction that came from witnessing human suffering firsthand. Even if you're right, he said slowly, we're talking about a $100 million manufacturing deal. Thousands of jobs, patients who are dying while they wait for this treatment. I know, Margaret said, her voice soft with understanding. I know it's not easy, but what if you're wrong? What if there are families out there who lose someone they love because we were too afraid to ask more questions? She thought of David's empty chair at their kitchen table, the 20 years of morning coffee she'd drunk alone. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Elena closed her laptop slowly. What exactly are you suggesting we do? She asked. Richard watched Margaret's face, seeing for the first time not just a waitress, but a woman who'd carried a terrible knowledge for 2 decades, waiting for the moment when she could prevent someone else's tragedy. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down at their table, uninvited, her movements deliberate and calm. I'm suggesting you extend your trials, she said, meeting Richard's eyes directly. 6 more months. Monitor for the specific cardiac markers that showed up in my husband's case. She slid a photocopied research paper across the table. Dr. Morrison at the State University documented everything. He'll help you design the additional testing. Richard felt his world shifting beneath him. The brighter manufacturing deal had a 48-hour expiration clause. If he pulled out now, they'd offer the contract to his biggest competitor, and Caldwell Pharmaceuticals would lose years of research investment. You're asking me to risk everything based on the experience of one patient from 20 years ago, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. I'm asking you to risk money to save lives, Margaret replied simply. The same choice your father probably made every day when he treated patients who couldn't pay. Richard's head snapped up in surprise. He'd never mentioned his father to anyone in this small town. Margaret smiled gently. I remember Dr. James Caldwell. He delivered my youngest daughter 43 years ago during a blizzard. Never sent us a bill. He used to say that medicine was about people, not profits. Elena had been quietly reviewing Margaret's documents, her scientific mind wrestling with the implications. The cardiac enzyme markers she's showing me, she said slowly. We didn't test for these specific combinations. We followed standard protocols, but she trailed off, her face pale with the recognition of what they might have missed. Richard stood abruptly, pacing to the diner's window. Outside, he could see his driver waiting beside the Bentley, probably checking his watch and wondering why the meeting was taking so long. The board of directors was expecting his call within the hour. Stock prices would soar when they announced the brighter deal. His legacy as a businessman would be secure. But as he stared at his reflection in the glass, he saw his father's face looking back at him. James Caldwell had died with less than $5,000 in his bank account. but hundreds of people had attended his funeral. They'd called him a hero, a man who'd put healing above wealth. When had Richard lost sight of that example? There's something else, Margaret said quietly. The university has new testing technology that wasn't available 20 years ago. Dr. Morrison says they could run comprehensive cardiac simulations in 6 weeks, not 6 months. The delay doesn't have to kill your timeline. It just has to be more thorough. Elena looked up from her laptop where she'd been researching Dr. Morrison's recent publications. She's right, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and professional excitement. His cardiac modeling software has been peer-reviewed extensively. If we partner with the university, we could actually strengthen our FDA application with additional data. Richard turned back to face Margaret, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not just a waitress with opinions, but a woman who'd spent 20 years carrying the knowledge that could save thousands of lives. What you're suggesting, he said slowly, it's not just about the medication, is it? You're asking me to remember who I wanted to be when I started this company. Margaret nodded, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. Your father would be proud of that choice, she said. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Richard reached for his phone, not to call Brighter, but to call Dr. Morrison. 6 months later, Margaret was wiping down table 6 when she noticed the familiar silver Bentley pulling into Mickey's parking lot. She smiled, already reaching for the coffee pot, as Richard Caldwell walked through the door. But this time, he wasn't alone. A young woman with kind eyes and her father's determined chin followed behind him. Margaret, Richard said warmly, accepting the coffee she poured without being asked. I'd like you to meet my daughter, Sarah. She's joining the company as our new director of patient advocacy. The young woman shook Margaret's hand with genuine respect, her grip firm and confident. Dad's told me so much about you, Sarah said, about how you saved countless lives by speaking up when it mattered most. Margaret blushed, still uncomfortable with being called a hero. To her, she'd simply done what needed to be done, what David would have expected of her. Richard spread new papers across the table. Not business contracts this time, but letters from patients and their families. The extended trials revealed. Everything you warned us about, he said. We redesigned the compound completely. It took 8 months longer than planned, cost us the Brighter deal, but we created something better, something safe. His voice carried a contentment Margaret had never heard during their first meeting. Elena approached their table, no longer Richard's employee, but now his business partner. We published our findings about the original compound's dangers, she explained to Margaret. Dr. Morrison co-authored the paper. 3 other pharmaceutical companies have abandoned similar formulations because of your husband's case study. David's story is going to save thousands of lives. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks, no longer caring who saw them. For 20 years, David's death had felt senseless, a tragic waste of a good man's life. But now somehow, his suffering had meaning. His story would protect other families from experiencing their heartbreak. There's something else, Richard said, his voice gentle. We're establishing the David Chen Foundation for Medication Safety, independent testing, patient advocacy, making sure what happened to your family never happens to anyone else. He handed Margaret a letter. We'd like you to serve on the board of directors. We need someone who understands that behind every formula, every clinical trial, every business decision, there are real people with families who love them. Margaret read the letter through her tears, recognizing the same handwriting that had once calculated profits, now dedicating resources to protection. I don't know anything about running a foundation, she said softly. You know the most important thing, Sarah replied. You know how to speak up when it matters, even when it's scary, even when nobody wants to listen. She glanced around the diner at the worn vinyl booths where her father had learned to remember his purpose. Dad says this place taught him more about business than Harvard ever did. Richard reached across the table and took Margaret's weathered hand in both of his. Thank you, he said simply. Thank you for having the courage to whisper the truth when everyone else was celebrating success. Thank you for making me remember why I became a doctor's son in the first place. As they prepared to leave, Margaret watched Richard help his daughter into her coat, the same gentle care she'd seen him show toward his research subjects during their second meeting. The billionaire had learned to be human again, And the waitress had discovered that her voice could change the world. The late afternoon sun streamed through Mickey's windows, casting everything in golden light. Margaret tucked the foundation letter into her apron pocket next to David's wedding ring that she still carried every day. Tomorrow she'd start a new chapter of her story. Tonight she'd go home and tell David all about it, the way she did every evening, knowing that somehow, somewhere, he was proud of the promise she'd finally kept. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of courage, love, and the power of speaking truth when it matters.